Hello, I'm Bryony and I work with the Egyptian collection at Macclesfield Museums. Today I'm going to be answering all the questions that I've been sent about mummification. But first I thought it would be good to just explain why the ancient Egyptians mummified people in the first place, because I think that it's just one of those things that you take for granted that the ancient Egyptians mummified people, but quite often you don't really wonder why. And the reason is that the ancient Egyptians believed that it was really important to preserve the body as best as it could be. So try to make it so that the flesh and the skin didn't rot away, so that you could look recognisably like a human being rather than just a skeleton. And the ancient Egyptians thought that this was so important because when somebody died, the ancient Egyptians believed that different parts of you left the body. So one of these parts was a little human-headed bird called the bar bird, and that could fly out and watch over the world of the living while you were in your tomb. And then another part was the car, which was kind of like how we imagine ghosts. So it looked very like the dead person, but the car would journey into the afterlife. But both of these things, the car and the bar bird, were both really dependent on the mummy being preserved well. Even though the bar bird could fly out of the tomb, it would always need to come back to rest in the body in the tomb. And the car also needed the body in the tomb as kind of like an anchor in the world of the living. So all of these things, the car, the bar bird and the mummy, were all dependent on each other. And without the mummy being well preserved, the bar bird and the car would be in quite a lot of trouble. And so would the dead person's hopes of an afterlife. Tyler from Year 3 asks when were dead bodies first mummified, and dead bodies were first mummified a really long time ago, even before the pyramids. And the very earliest mummies were made by burying them in the sand and then they'd dry out, and that would preserve the dead body. The reason why things rot away is because of bacteria, and bacteria need water and air to survive. So if you put something that could rot, like some fruit or a dead body, in a place where there isn't any water or where there isn't any air, then whatever it is won't rot away, because the bacteria won't be able to survive without water or air. So when the ancient Egyptians were burying bodies in the dry sand, they were putting the dead bodies in a place where there wasn't any water, so the bacteria wouldn't be able to rot it away. But more recently, people have realised that this wasn't just like an accidental thing. The ancient Egyptians, even at this really early time period, were actually using plant oils and resins in the wrappings of these really early mummies. And these are things that were used in later mummification too. And plant oils and resins also helped to kill the bacteria in the same kind of way that soap does. Evie from Year 4 asks when were dead bodies mummified? And first of all, I think it's important to bear in mind that mummification was quite an expensive process, so you'd have to be rich enough to be able to afford it. But if you were rich enough, it was really important that you were mummified quite quickly. And that was because mummification could help to prevent rotting from happening, but it couldn't undo any rotting that had already taken place. So the ancient Egyptians seem to have been quite worried actually that they might die in a place or way that would make it difficult for them to be mummified quickly. But when in ancient Egyptian history could you be mummified? Well, mummification took place over the whole of ancient Egyptian history and even beyond. So if we count the really early mummies that I talked about in the previous question, then mummification happened in some form over a period of about 4,000 years, from about 3,700 BCE to 700 CE, which is a really long time. And obviously when you think about how long a period of time that is, it doesn't seem that surprising that over that period of time the techniques for mummification changed a lot over time and developed as the ancient Egyptians learned more about the effects that the different techniques were having on the mummified corpse as it was preserved through history. In the Old Kingdom, which is when the pyramids were built, the ancient Egyptians tried to mummify people without the use of the sand that they'd used earlier. So they'd really carefully wrap up the dead bodies in cloth, and sometimes they would use plaster or resins to help keep the shape of the dead body. But often this mummification wasn't very successful and the body would rot away anyway, so you'd end up with really just the skeleton. In the Middle Kingdom, which came after the Old Kingdom, the techniques of mummification still weren't that great really, but more people could have mummification. It became much more widespread in the Middle Kingdom. But really, mummification as we think about it now only really started in the New Kingdom, which is when Tutankhamun was around. In the New Kingdom, they would cut a slit down the left side of the body and remove the organs and use a salt called natron and resins to help dry out and clean the body. In the Third Intermediate period, the ancient Egyptians went a step further and actually put sawdust and padding underneath the skin of the dead body's face and body to try and make it look more lifelike. Because they noticed that with all of the dead bodies that were all dried, although it was really well preserved, they looked quite shriveled because of all of the water that the bodies had lost. So this padding would help to pad them out to make them look more like they were alive. Another thing that they did was they actually put fake eyes in to make it seem even more lifelike. The next question is from Hannah Rose, and she wants to know, did they use spices in mummification? And this is actually such a good question that Egyptologists don't really know the answer for certain. The problem is that we have two different ways to find out about mummification in ancient Egypt. The first is to find out what the ancient Egyptians wrote about how they mummified people, and the second is to do scientific tests on the mummies that we have to try and work out how they were created. Unfortunately, the ancient Egyptians didn't really write down very much about how they mummified people. So the main information that we have is from ancient Greek writers, and they say that the spices cinnamon and cassia were used in mummification. But the problem with this is that the ancient Greek writers were writing very late on in ancient Egyptian history. So they were writing about 1,000 years after Tutankhamun was around and 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. So it's difficult to know whether the mummification techniques that they're writing about, including the use of spices, were just specific to that time period that they were living in, rather than the time period that we think of when we think about ancient Egypt. One of the ancient Greek writers in particular says some really strange things that make people question whether they should be trusted at all. For example, they say that there were these giant furry gold-digging ants that existed. Another problem is that when we've done scientific tests on mummies, we haven't been able to find any traces of spices. So that tells a very different story from these ancient Greek writers. So really, we don't know for sure. Spices could be a thing that was introduced only around the time of the ancient Greek writers, or it could just be that the spices don't show up on the scientific tests. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about mummification. Join me next time and I'll be answering some more of your questions.